Over the last Labour government, 1997 to 2010, relative child poverty fell from 33% to 27%, and about half of that fall has been undone in the years since then.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Carl Emerson, one of the Deputy Directors at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Before we start today's episode, some exciting news. I want to let you know about our first ever live edition of the IFS Zooms In. We're going to be hosting an exclusive in-person recording of our podcast in central London that's going to look at how the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, can make her first budget a success. The budget represents a critical opportunity for any government capable of shaping how we all live, work and spend. And the first budget of a parliament is often a really big one. So we'll explore lessons from some of the most successful, but also some of the most challenging budgets in history. And after the recording, there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask our expert panel questions. The event is taking place on the 23rd of October at the British Library in London. It's free to attend, but spaces are limited, and you can secure one by heading to www.ifs.org.uk/events and register there, and you can find that link in the episode description. But for now, on with the show. And today we're going to be discussing child poverty in the UK. Currently there's about 4.3 million children. That's around about 30%, 3 in 10 of all kids are living in relative poverty. Since 2010, that figure has risen by over 700,000 children. And the new government has said that tackling child poverty is one of its key priorities. And is going to be a cross-government strategy that's due to be published before the end of next year. So in today's episode, we're going to look at what's contributing to the increase in child poverty. What challenges does the benefit system, the labour market, the housing market and the broader economic context create in this area? We'll look at some of the long-run impacts that child poverty has, and we'll examine some of the potential policy options available to the government to reduce child poverty. And I'm pleased to say that we're joined here today by Tom Waters and Christine Farquharson, who are both colleagues of mine here at the IFS. So Christine, I mentioned in the intro that there's 4.3 million children who are currently living in relative poverty. What do we mean by relative poverty, and how poor do you have to be below that poverty line?
So I think people often have quite an intuitive sense of what they think poverty means or what they understand poverty to mean. But actually, when we talk about relative poverty and when we calculate some of those statistics that you gave at the start of the episode, we're really talking about a very specific definition. We take your household income after tax and after benefits, so after you've paid the exchequer and received any benefits due to you, and then usually after housing costs as well. We then calculate the median level of that, so sort of halfway up the income distribution. And if you're earning less than 60% of that median line, then you're considered to be in relative poverty. Now, that's all pretty technical and pretty convoluted. There's even more convolution because the other thing you have to do is equivalize those household incomes. You have to take account of the fact that a household with one single adult needs less to live on than a household with many children. And that means the income levels that put you in relative poverty, they differ too. But to give you a sense, if you're a single adult living on your own, after you've paid your tax, received your benefits, paid for your housing costs, then you need about 10 grand a year to be considered not to be in relative poverty. If you're below that, you're in relative poverty. If, by contrast, you're a lone parent with 2 children, that threshold is a little bit over 20 grand a year. So you can see that household composition makes a big difference.
So I think the idea that you need to adjust for the number of adults, number of children in the household makes sense. More people in the household need more money to have the same standards of living. The other thing you described, though, is your amount you have relative to that family that's in the middle of the distribution. What's the logic there? Would it not mean that if that family in the middle of the distribution gets richer, that might make you suddenly become in poverty?
It does. And so that's because we're talking here about relative poverty, which is really relative to how others in the economy are doing. Are you so far off the scale? Are you so far down the scale that we consider your standard of living to be too low relative to what the average family experiences? There's a different measure called absolute poverty, which takes a kind of cut point of income. And that tries to get at just what do we think you need to have to be in poverty or not. And then there's other measures too. You can look at things like material deprivation. Do you have specific goods that we think kind of add up to a good quality of life? Or you can look at some of the kind of wider research that's going on of what do families need to have to enjoy a good standard of living. So there's lots of different definitions, but relative poverty is one that's pretty commonly used.
Yeah, so lots of different definitions, and probably understandable, probably good to look at lots of different definitions when different things may be going on in the economy. So Tom, turning to you now, I mean, what's been happening to child poverty in recent years, and do we know why those changes have been happening?
So we've had a bit of an increase in child poverty since about 2010. That follows a period where it had been falling. So over the last Labour government, 1997 to 2010, relative child poverty fell by from 33% to 27%. And about half of that fall has been undone in the years since then. And when you look into the data, it turns out that that's driven entirely by larger families. So children who live, whether the only child in the household or where they have one brother or sister with them, those families have still seen a reduction, a small reduction, but a reduction in relative poverty. All of the increase is driven by families that have got at least 3 kids.
Okay, so we had that period between 97 and 2010, child poverty falling over the period pretty sharply. And since then, an increase, but not for small families, only for those families with more children. Is it surprising that it's larger families that are both more likely to be in poverty, and that's where the increases have been happening?
Yeah, that's a good point. Is large families have been more likely to be in poverty for some time. It's just that the gap has opened up even more. Is it surprising? I mean, so over the 2010s, one of the most important things that was going on for poverty was a range of benefit cuts. And I think there's 2 things worth noting here. One is that some benefit cuts were specifically targeted at larger families. The most obvious one is the so-called 2-child limit, which means that you only get means-tested benefits for the first 2 children in a family. That obviously only affects larger families. But then the second thing that's going on is that there were a range of other benefit cuts. There was, freezes to the value of benefits, which means that in real terms they fall, for example. And that tends to affect larger families as well, just because they're more likely to be on benefits, and so they're more exposed to these sorts of changes.
Yeah, and I think actually in the data, I was quite interested to see that, so Christine said you need to adjust for family size. So if a family with 4 or 5 children is going to need more income, but before you do that adjustment, families with 4 or 5 children tend to have lower incomes than families with fewer children.
Right, exactly. And you can kind of understand part of what's going on there is obviously the number of children you have is going to have implications for the kind of work that you can do and therefore your income.
So 2-child limit, reducing the amount of benefits available to families with 3 or more children, pushing more children into poverty. Well, what's the justification for the 2-child limit? Why would you want it if it's having such a bad effect on these children?
Well, it was brought in, it was announced at Summer Budget 2015. And so if you cast your mind back to then, that was in the context of then Chancellor George Osborne looking to save £12 billion off welfare, which had been promised in the Conservative manifesto. And this was a fairly chunky saving. It saves something like £2.5 billion, there or thereabouts. So it goes some way to making up that £12 billion. And so to some extent, this is like any other benefit choice, is if you reduce benefits, that saves the government some money, but it means that lower income families have got less to go on. And part of the justification that the government gave at that point was that they wanted poorer families to face the same kinds of financial incentives to have or not have children as those who aren't on benefits. And so I get that, in some sense, more of a political judgment. But that seems to be part of why they chose this route rather than, just kind of cutting the overall level of benefits more or something like that.
Tom, do we know anything with the 2-child limit about how many families are affected because they had a 3rd child when they were already on benefits versus because they had a 3rd child and then came into the benefit system?
I think the answer to that question is no, we don't know. But what we do know is that the number of people that receive means-tested benefits at some point in their life is quite a lot more than the number who are receiving at any point in time. So most people receive a means-tested benefit, or in a household that receives a means-tested benefit at some point in their life, whereas any given point in time, it's something like a quarter, something in that order. And so that does mean, as you're kind of hinting at, that some people who have a 3rd child and then later on start claiming benefits will exactly be in that situation.
And so the focus so far has been entirely about income. If I've got enough income, I won't be in poverty. If I haven't, I will be. But when we think about child poverty, we're not really just focused on how much income is going into the household where the child happens to live. And we also presumably particularly worried about children because we're worried about other consequences for those children of being in a low-income household. Christine, how much do we know about how damaging is it to be in a low-income household as a child? And is this something that really does matter?
It really does matter, at least in the correlational sense. So if you look at the outcomes for children who grow up in poorer families versus children who grow up in better off households, there's a world of difference. Just to pick a couple of statistics, at age 3, children in the richest fifth of families are 3 times more likely to have high levels of development than those in the poorest fifth of families. That continues to age 5. You see a big gap between children eligible for free school meals and not when you look in the education system. And like we've talked about on previous podcasts, that gap you're stuck with for the entirety of the education system. You see sort of similar inequalities in terms of health outcomes and in terms of longer term outcomes too. We know that there is some intergenerational persistence. If you grow up in a poorer household, you're more likely to be poor yourself as an adult. So those correlations are really strong and really striking. Where it becomes a little bit more challenging is trying to understand how much of that is strictly poverty per se, so strictly not having income in the household or money in the household, versus how much of that is related to other factors that tend to come along with poverty. So, for example, we know that families in poverty often the parents have lower levels of education. Often the parents have poorer mental health. Often there's sort of less knowledge or less a bit time even to engage in kind of positive parenting activities. And so those wider factors, some of those might well be caused by poverty. You could think that a parent with poor mental health is under a lot of stress because they're struggling to make the rent each month. Some of those might themselves be causing poverty. If you have low education, low qualifications, you might struggle to earn as well in the labour market as somebody who's better qualified. And so you end up with a very difficult to untangle kind of nest of causes and consequences. What we can say is work that some colleagues at IFS did looked at some of the biggest determinants of inequalities in children's cognitive development and their social and emotional development. So essentially their school smarts and their mental health at age 3. And if you look at the cognitive side, the biggest thing there is coming from the child's educational environment. So what kinds of qualifications does the parent have? How is the mother's language skills? What's the home learning environment like? If you look at the social and emotional side of that, by far, like massively by far, the biggest predictor there is coming from the child's emotional environment. So how close is the parent-child relationship? How much conflict is there? How well do the two parents relate to one another if they're both in the same house? What's the mother's mental health like? And so some of those factors could well be downstream consequences of poverty, but equally it's those rather than strictly income per se that really seem to be the mediating pathway to bad child outcomes.
So it might be that being in a low-income household as a child causes those challenges for your parents, and that then has knock-on consequences for you. Or it could be that parents who are facing those types of challenges are more likely to be both low-income and also end up having children who struggle at school.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's almost certainly a big chunk of both of those explanations. This is, when you're talking about poverty and consequences for children, you are very much in a world where everything affects everything else. And it makes it really hard to get the kind of clean causal estimates that we sometimes like. But it also means that if you're intervening in one part of the system, you have a pretty good chance of hitting a few other goals at the same time.
So that suggests that for a policymaker, yes, there might be lots of different things you might think that you could intervene in to help if you want to reduce child poverty or reduce the impact that child poverty has. And in some of those interventions, you might have some beneficial other effects. But it also strikes me that you might intervene in the wrong place or the least effective place. What do we know about, if you had to choose or if you had to prioritise a set of things, where would you be looking to intervene to either reduce child poverty or the impact it has on children?
If you want to reduce child poverty, full stop, basically the easiest thing you do is you work through the benefit system. The second easiest thing you do is you try and work through the labour market to help parents get more earnings in. Those are pretty much the two tools that you have. If you're trying to reduce the impacts of child poverty on children, then you have a wider set of tools. So you could go for the sort of pure cash transfer. You could say poverty is at the root of this. We want households to have an adequate standard of living, and then we trust families to kind of get on with it and improve all of those other things for children. You could say, okay, well, we think poverty and living standards is at the root of this, but we're worried about how households make decisions. And so we think a more efficient thing might be, instead of giving cash, to give sort of in-kind subsidies. And so there you might think of programs like free school meals, so poorer children eat school lunch for free, Healthy Start vouchers, poorer children have access to subsidized fruits and vegetables in the first few years of life, and even some subsidies around housing costs or other things that families might need to buy. In Scotland, baby boxes. There's a whole set of programs that aim to take something we think households are buying and give that to them either in kind or in a voucher. The third set of tools that you have is really much broader and more holistic, and that's trying to say, we're going to not go after poverty and living standards per se. We're going to try and intervene on some of those other consequences or those other mediating factors that we've talked about. And that list is as long as you want to make it. So that could be parental mental health support to try and help mothers with poorer mental health. That could help the child. That could also help them in the labour market. That might be parenting programs to provide information and support and guidance and help to families who might benefit from that. Parenting kind of home visiting programs would fall into there as well. But really, almost every department in almost every area of public services is going to have some programs that are aimed at trying to mitigate the consequences of poverty for children. And really, those consequences are so wide-ranging and so broad. Pretty much anywhere you could intervene, you could make an argument that you're trying to mitigate that.
It also strikes me that in some of these interventions, you're going to have to be a bit more patient. It will take time to have the kind of effects you might have, relative certainly to just give the household a bit more cash. But it also strikes me that you might have more enduring impacts. Tom described how a Labour government reduced child poverty, but then half of that was reversed when a subsequent government decided it wanted to reduce the generosity of the benefit system. If you intervene in these ways, other ways, perhaps you can have more enduring effects?
Potentially. There's a whole kind of other debate about, particularly in the early years, if you do some of these interventions, to what extent do those benefits persist? And I think the upshot of that is you've got a good chance of them persisting, but you've got a much better chance of them persisting if you follow that up with subsequent intervention and if you remove some of the headwinds. So if you're doing a kind of gold standard, really intensive parenting program when a child is 1, and then that child gets moved into temporary accommodation and becomes homeless all through their schooling career, is that really the right mix of policies and the right mix of intervention at the right time to provide the best outcomes for that kid?
Tom, you spoke before about sort of some of the reductions in the benefit system and increasing poverty. We now have a government that wants to reduce child poverty. Christine said, well, you might want to look at the labour market, the housing market, but in some ways giving extra cash through the benefit system is an easy, obvious way. What do we know about how beneficial that can be? Are there advantages in that approach?
Yeah, I think in the UK, the evidence we have is pretty limited. I think it's really limited to one paper which looks at a small payment that used to be made. It was actually, I think, made for about 2 years, around 2010, called Health in Pregnancy, which paid a little bit less than 200 quid to pretty much all mothers. And evidence from that suggests that the existence of that payment reduced the prevalence of low birth weight.
That was a one-off £200 payment.
Yeah.
Not a huge intervention.
Indeed. No, not a huge intervention, but there's kind of a nice paper studying that, and the way it was rolled out means that you can identify that it had an effect on birth weight. I think beyond that in the UK, the evidence is pretty thin, but we do have some evidence internationally, which I'd say you kind of get, taking it as a whole, you get kind of a mix of limited effects and positive effects from these sorts of benefits. So quite a lot of research looks at a tax credit in the United States called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which goes to low-income workers. And a lot of that research finds that has positive impacts on the children. They have better educational outcomes, better health outcomes. Some work now is even able to look at how they do it as adults. And it seems like having got this tax credit as a child, that seems to improve their likelihood of being in work, for example. At the same time, you can also find instances where government spent fairly large sums of money and it didn't seem to have any sizable impact on the kids. And so I think to some extent what we don't really deeply understand is what kinds of circumstances make these reforms more or less effective. And perhaps what Christine was talking about earlier, and the wider context and to what extent you follow it up with other interventions, whether that has that explains some of this variation in effect.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the earned income tax credit studies that you're mentioning is really that's partly an intervention that gives families cash, that's partly an intervention that encourages parents to go out and into the labour market and move into paid work. And so you're pulling two levers at the same time. And that makes it hard to disentangle what really is the pure cash. I mean, work that we did at IFS during the COVID pandemic, we looked at the furlough scheme, which provided parents with quite a lot of financial insurance. You know, most people earned close to or indeed exactly the same amount of money as they did when they were working. And so you might think, okay, well, that's going to protect the children in these households from the impact of all of the negative shocks and uncertainty around their parents' job. But actually what we found is that the kids whose parents were furloughed looked much more like the kids whose parents lost their job than they did like the kids whose parents continued. And that's, we kind of dug into mechanisms. A lot of that is down to parental stress and parental relationships. So that financial insurance is worth something, is a useful tool. But I think you're more likely to have a more powerful intervention if you're bundling that with some other interventions that try and address some of those downstream causes as well. Because, you know, purely giving cash, it will help, but it may not help as much if you've got all of those other headwinds facing the family as well.
So moving on from the labour market, the other big expenditure in people's lives is going to be housing. Christine set out how when we look at relative poverty, you can look at it before people incur their housing costs, but we tend to look at it afterwards. I guess, Tom, perhaps you could talk us through why we make that judgment call when we're looking at families with children, and then what might government do if it's trying to help people with their housing costs?
Yeah, okay, so it is a little bit of a judgment call whether or not to net off housing costs when you're thinking about poverty. I think there's quite a lot of arguments that can be given either way. Perhaps to kind of give the counter argument first thing to say, well, you know, housing is an expense like anything else. You know, we don't not net off food costs when we're calculating how much income people have. We don't say it's income after food costs or anything like that. Why do this with housing? I think the housing is a bit of a special case for a couple of reasons. And the first one is that the amount people pay in housing costs is often actually not very closely related to the kind of quality and amount of housing that they're getting. So if you think about social rents, for example, the whole point of social housing is that you're getting a subsidised rent. You pay less than this property would go for if it was marketed in the private market. And so there, the price that you're paying, the rent you're paying, isn't actually a very good indicator of the value you're getting from it. Similar arguments can be made when thinking about mortgages as well. It isn't the amount you're paying in your mortgage or mortgage interest, which is what we take off when we're calculating after housing cost income, that isn't necessarily really the same as what private renters, for example, would pay for the same property. So that's one reason I think to look at after housing costs for thinking about income. And kind of related to that is, you know, people can't very easily change what kind of housing they move into a lot of the time. Again, social housing is a good example. It's often very long queues. You can't just very straightforwardly walk into a social rented property tomorrow. And so if you kind of take off the rent that they're paying there, that kind of helps like net out the effect that this isn't really a chosen thing in the way that food or something is more, you've got more of a direct choice over. So that's kind of why we think about housing income after deducting housing costs. How does this relate to policy? Well, policy in many ways has a really important impact, of course, on the housing market, lots of different ways. We tax housing in lots of sometimes curious ways. You pay stamp duty when you buy a house. Housing is subject to different capital gains treatment. There's important questions about the way landlords are taxed on the income they get from their property. And then, of course, there's the actual building side. How much housing gets built, how easy it is to build houses, that's going to matter for the rents that people end up paying. And so all this kind of coming a long way round to saying that if there's, you know, significant increase in housing supply, and the new government has said that that's a kind of a key goal for them, if that is achieved and that's successful at pushing down rents, then that's going to be likely to actually reduce the child poverty numbers as well. And perhaps particularly important in this context as well is that over time poverty has become more of a private rented phenomenon, both because social housing is less common and because private renting as well is becoming more common, and owner occupations moving more towards the top of the income distribution. And so actually getting rents down could be quite an effective tool for reducing child poverty too.
So Christine also mentioned the idea of just trying to boost employment and labour markets that work well, parents that are in paid work, more likely to have children who are not in poverty, not just because there's more cash going in, but maybe the stability of that employment and other features of having parents working is good. What is the potential for the government to reduce child poverty through labour market interventions, through boosting employment?
I think the first thing to note is that unless the government's able to increase employment in a really targeted way, just a general increase in employment isn't particularly targeted at reducing poverty because, for example, there might be a family where there's two parents, one is in work, and that person earns enough that they're already above the poverty line. Now, the second partner could get into work, but they're still already out of poverty, and so it wouldn't change the poverty rate. Similarly, there's plenty of people who aren't in work who don't have any kids. Obviously, getting them into work isn't going to change child poverty rate. So in that sense, it's not very targeted. It's not to say, of course, it's a bad idea at all. There's plenty of other reasons why you might be concerned about the employment rate, but it's not something that's very kind of closely targeted on child poverty. The government has said that they've got this ambition to reach an 80% employment rate. I think it's fair to describe that as a very ambitious target. It would take us to have one of the very highest employment rates in the OECD. And if they did manage it, it would reduce child poverty. We think it's difficult to say because it does depend on exactly who's getting into work, but we think something in the order of 200,000 or 300,000 people. And so to give you kind of a sense of scale, abolishing the two-child limit would reduce child poverty by about 550,000. So even if this very ambitious target was met, it would still only be about half as big an effect as removing the two-child limit. So it's not a very targeted approach. That's not to say it's a bad thing, because of course there's other things you might care about with it. But if what your goal is to reduce child poverty, there's certainly other tools that are more laser focused on that.
Yeah, and in fact, that reduction in child poverty actually sounds to me like quite a big number, but that probably just reflects how ambitious the 80% target is. Christine, turning back to something you mentioned earlier about providing directly some of the things that households are purchasing, and you mentioned 3 school meals. That seems to be perhaps an obvious way of both helping low-income families with children, perhaps also delivering, making sure that they get a decent meal while at school. How beneficial are free school meals? What do we know about what impact they're having on families with children?
So we know that free school meals are a pretty chunky cash transfer, actually. If you were to buy those school meals at the cost the government pays, you're looking at something like £460 a year per child. So that's pretty meaningful in the context of that lone parent with 2 kids needing 20 grand a year. It's about 1,000. So it matters quite a lot to family finances. In terms of what it does for children's outcomes, if we look kind of more broadly at nutritional policies, there's some good evidence that nutritional support benefits children's outcomes, and usually that means either their body weight or their academic attainment or their behavior. Those are the 3 main ones that people look at. We know a lot less, actually, about the impact of free school meals on children who receive means-tested free school meals. Because this policy has been in place for such a long time, it's really difficult to get a grasp of what the counterfactual is. And because we don't have good income data that really lets us work out who's just above the threshold, who's just below, it's pretty hard to work out the benefits of being eligible for free school meals on that poorest roughly fifth of children. What we do know is there have been a few studies that expand universal free school meals, so to children higher up the income distribution. And that policy seems to improve body weight a little bit, so children are less likely to be overweight or obese, and potentially has some benefits for academic attainment. We also see, when we look at kind of wider nutritional interventions, things like breakfast clubs, those can be pretty beneficial for children's academic attainment too. But the devil is kind of in the detail for a lot of this, because the quality of the food on offer really matters. If you look at evidence from the US, where the quality of school meals or school breakfast clubs, sometimes that food is not so great, not necessarily what you'd want your child eating, actually offering more school food there increases obesity and potentially makes academic attainment worse. One of my all-time favorite papers from the US looked at this, and they introduced a sort of extra healthy school meal menu, and they found that was really, really effective. And then the follow-on was that they discovered that head teachers were introducing that special school menu only on exam day. So to try and game the system and it worked. They were genuinely getting appreciable benefits on the sort of overall exam scores of that school just by changing the menu that one day. So there's a kind of short-term effect and a longer-term effect that you can think about too.
And the new government has said that it's interested in rolling out breakfast clubs. I think announced some details about how it's going to do that. What do we know about how they're approaching it and whether they've read these papers and how much they're taking seriously the evidence we have?
So I think the commitment to rolling out breakfast clubs throughout England is there's kind of two aims that you can think about with that. You can think about this as really about poverty, nutrition, supporting children to have a good, healthy meal at the start of the school day. Or you can think about this as a childcare intervention, giving parents somewhere to drop off their kids before they go to work. And those two things can go together, which is not always the case. They can go together. You can have good childcare and a good school meal and a good environment for the children to kind of meet, interact, play, get some craziness out of their systems before they sit down. But if you're doing a childcare intervention, you need a much longer breakfast club. And if you're really using this as a nutrition intervention to try and help the poorest families, you need to think quite hard about what you're going to do to make that accessible and attractive to them. When we did an evaluation a few years ago of breakfast clubs, our qualitative partners found that actually a lot of families were surprisingly reluctant to use them, even though they were free, because it was too much of a hassle getting the kids to school early. It was difficult to work into their work patterns or their commuting patterns. And so schools ended up doing things like putting on walking buses to go house to house to house, collecting primary school kids and bringing them in to benefit from the breakfast club. That's part of the reason why take-up of breakfast clubs tends to be relatively low. So there's a lot of moving parts here. Basically, the more beneficial you're going to want to be on childcare and on children's nutrition, the more you're going to have to spend. And the more that you try and get children in and boost that take-up rate, the more you're going to have to spend as well.
And it also sounds like there's lots of details you need to think through about what things have to come together to make the policy actually get to the people you want it to have. If you're starting to think about, do we need to think about how to get the children to school for the breakfast club? Well, you wouldn't necessarily be thinking about transport policy alongside your breakfast club policy, but it sounds like all of those things do need to come together.
They do. And the benefit we have here is that, Wales has been here first. So Wales has had a similar policy for many, many years now. There have been many schools in England already offer breakfast clubs, either that the school funds themselves or that charities provide. There's the National School Breakfast Programme, which reaches quite a few schools at the moment. So there's lots of examples to learn from. But you're right, as with all big policy interventions, the details of how you actually go about implementing them really do matter.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you very much, Tom. I think we'll draw that to a close now. Lots of really interesting, fascinating evidence. Lots of big challenges for those looking to reduce both the numbers of children in poverty and also the impacts that has. We've heard about how being a child in poverty is certainly associated with a much worse set of outcomes subsequently, but the picture being pretty complicated in terms of all the different ways you can intervene, through giving households cash, which can be pretty expensive, perhaps not enduring, through other interventions which can be hard to design right, and certainly lots of options on the table for the government as it carries out its child poverty strategy and then seeks to reduce child poverty over the rest of this Parliament. So thank you very much for listening to this episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, please do visit our website, www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. Thank you.